Have you ever wondered how your car can start with a completely cold engine, reach operating temperature, and then keep that temperature under control? One small component is responsible for controlling one of the most important parts of that process. It's called the thermostat. It may look like a simple little valve, but if it stops working correctly, it can cause overheating, poor fuel economy, weak cabin heat, and even serious engine damage. So what exactly does a thermostat do? How does it know when to open? What happens when it gets stuck? And how can you tell if your thermostat is actually the problem? Let's break it down step by step. First, let's understand why your engine needs a thermostat in the first place. When you start your car in the morning, the engine is cold, but an internal combustion engine works best within a specific temperature range. It doesn't perform at its best when it's completely cold, and it doesn't perform at its best when it's excessively hot. The engine needs to reach its normal operating temperature relatively quickly and then stay close to that temperature. This is where the cooling system comes in. The cooling system uses coolant to absorb heat from the engine. That hot coolant can then travel to the radiator, where the heat is released into the surrounding air. The coolant is then sent back toward the engine to absorb more heat. Sounds simple, right? But there's a problem. If the coolant immediately started flowing through the radiator as soon as you started a cold engine, the engine would take much longer to warm up, and that's exactly what the thermostat prevents. Think of the thermostat as an automatic door inside the cooling system. When the engine is cold, that door is mostly closed. The coolant can still circulate through the engine, through the designed bypass passages, but the thermostat prevents the main flow from going through the radiator. This allows the engine to warm up faster. And that's important for several reasons. A cold engine produces more emissions. Fuel doesn't vaporize as efficiently. Engine oil is thicker. Fuel consumption can be higher, and the engine may not operate as efficiently as it does at normal temperature. So the thermostat helps the engine reach its normal operating temperature as quickly as possible. But how does the thermostat know when to open? This is where things get interesting. A traditional mechanical thermostat doesn't need an electrical sensor or a computer to decide when to open. Inside the thermostat is a temperature-sensitive material, usually a wax-filled element. As the coolant temperature increases, the wax expands. That expansion pushes against a small piston. The piston moves the valve, and as the valve opens, coolant can begin flowing through the radiator. So the thermostat is essentially a temperature-controlled mechanical valve. No battery, no software, just temperature, expanding wax, pressure, and a spring. Now let's imagine what happens during a normal cold start. The engine has been sitting overnight. The coolant is cold. You start the engine. The thermostat is closed. The engine begins producing heat. Because the main path to the radiator is restricted, the engine warms up relatively quickly. As the coolant temperature approaches the thermostat's designed opening temperature, the wax element begins expanding. The valve starts to open. Coolant begins flowing through the radiator. The radiator removes heat from the coolant. That cooler coolant returns to the engine. And the cycle continues. The thermostat doesn't simply snap completely open at one exact temperature. In many systems, it begins opening around its rated temperature and continues opening as the temperature rises. This allows the cooling system to regulate temperature rather than simply switching between completely on and completely off. Now, here's something important. The thermostat does not directly control the temperature gauge on your dashboard, and it doesn't create cooling by itself. Its main job is to control coolant flow between the engine and the radiator. The radiator is responsible for releasing heat. The water pump moves the coolant. The cooling fan helps move air through the radiator when necessary. And the thermostat controls when the coolant is allowed to use the main radiator circuit. All of these components have to work together. This is why replacing the thermostat isn't always the solution when a car overheats. For example, imagine the thermostat is working perfectly, but the water pump isn't circulating coolant properly. The engine can still overheat. Or imagine the radiator is blocked. The thermostat can open normally, but the radiator won't be able to remove enough heat, or the cooling fan could fail. The car might stay at a normal temperature while driving because air is naturally moving through the radiator, but overheat when sitting in traffic. That's why diagnosing an overheating problem requires looking at the entire cooling system. Now let's talk about the first major thermostat failure. A thermostat can get stuck closed. This is one of the more serious situations. If the thermostat remains closed when the engine becomes hot, the main flow of coolant to the radiator can be severely restricted. The engine continues producing heat, but the radiator isn't receiving the coolant it needs to remove that heat. The temperature can keep rising, and if the overheating becomes severe, the engine can suffer serious damage. You might see the temperature gauge climb above its normal position. You may get an overheating warning. Coolant may be pushed out of the expansion tank, or you may notice steam or a strong coolant smell. If that happens, don't keep driving simply because the car still seems to run. An overheating engine can turn a relatively small cooling system problem into a very expensive engine repair. Now let's look at the opposite problem. What happens if the thermostat gets stuck open? This is usually less immediately dangerous than a thermostat stuck closed. With a thermostat stuck open, coolant can flow through the radiator even when the engine is still cold. The engine may take much longer to reach normal operating temperature. You might notice that the temperature gauge stays unusually low. The cabin heater may take longer to produce warm air. Fuel consumption can increase, and the engine may not operate as efficiently as designed. On some modern vehicles, the engine computer may also detect that the engine is taking too long to reach its expected operating temperature and store a diagnostic trouble code. So, a thermostat stuck open doesn't necessarily cause dramatic overheating. Instead, the problem can be the opposite. The engine is running too cool. Now, here's a common mistake. People sometimes assume that if the temperature gauge is normal, the thermostat must be working perfectly. Not necessarily. The dashboard gauge is only giving you a general indication of engine temperature. Different vehicles behave differently, and modern temperature gauges can remain in the middle over a range of actual temperatures. That's why diagnoses shouldn't rely on the gauge alone. You can also look for other symptoms. Does the engine take unusually long to warm up? Does the heater remain cold during normal driving? Does the temperature rise rapidly? Does the coolant flow behave differently than expected? Does the cooling system repeatedly overheat? These clues can help point toward the real problem. Another important point is that thermostat specifications are different from one engine to another. You should never assume that every thermostat opens at the same temperature. A thermostat might be designed to begin opening at a particular temperature specified by the manufacturer. So if you're replacing one, use the correct thermostat for the exact engine and vehicle. Installing the wrong thermostat can affect engine temperature control. Now, can you test the thermostat? Sometimes you can perform basic checks without removing it. One simple observation is to monitor how the engine warms up from cold. You can also compare the temperature of different cooling system components as the engine warms up. However, be careful. A hot cooling system can be pressurized. Never remove a radiator cap or expansion tank cap when the engine is hot, unless the vehicle manufacturer specifically provides a safe procedure for doing so. Hot coolant can cause severe burns. For a more accurate diagnosis, a scan tool can sometimes show the coolant temperature reported by the engine temperature sensor. This can help you understand what's actually happening instead of relying only on the dashboard gauge. If the thermostat is suspected, it can also be removed and tested according to the manufacturer's procedure. Some thermostats can be tested in heated water while monitoring the opening temperature, but the exact procedure and specifications depend on the vehicle. So don't use a random temperature value from another car. Now, let's put everything together. The thermostat has one simple job, but that job is extremely important. When the engine is cold, it restricts the main coolant flow to help the engine warm up quickly. As the engine reaches its designed operating temperature, the thermostat opens and allows more coolant to flow through the radiator. The radiator removes heat. The water pump circulates the coolant. The cooling fan helps move air through the radiator when needed, and the thermostat controls the transition between warm-up and full cooling system operation. So the next time you see that small metal valve, remember, it's not just a piece of metal sitting inside the cooling system. It's one of the components that helps your engine stay within the temperature range. It was designed to operate in, and when it fails, the symptoms can range from poor heating and increased fuel consumption to serious overheating. That's why diagnosing the thermostat correctly matters. Don't replace it just because the engine is overheating. Find out why the engine is overheating. Check the coolant level. Look for leaks. Consider the radiator. Check the cooling fan. Consider the water pump. And then determine whether the thermostat is actually causing the problem. Because in automotive diagnosis, replacing parts isn't the same thing as finding the cause. If you want more videos that explain how the systems inside your car actually work, subscribe to the channel. And in the next video, we'll take a closer look at another part that can make the difference between a healthy engine and an overheating one.